Hi, welcome everybody. Sorry that we've had to start a moment late, but thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to be welcoming our panel of speakers here today for our webinar, Breaking Barriers, How LGBTQ plus Disability Advocates Transform Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. I will be throwing over to our host, Amberly Henson, in just a moment. Welcome to Amberly and Will Ward-Boas and Amy Corcoran, who has kindly stepped in at the last minute because Emily Unity is an apology, sent our apologies to you all today. But so excited to have Amberly and Amy and Will with us today. I'm Liz Wilkinson. You've probably seen me at our previous webinars. I'm she, they pronouns. I'm the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Manager over at LGBTIQ Plus Health Australia. And I will be online in the chat and supporting the team. But as I said, I'd like to pass on to Amberly Henson, she, her, who's our host for today. Amberly is a gender diverse and neurodivergent consumer advocate. Her work strives for better mental health supports for LGBTIQA plus neurodivergent and disabled consumers. She is currently a member of the Peer Expert Advisory Group for the Mind Out program and is a member of Stonington Council's LGBTIQA plus advisory board. Through lived experience, Amberly understands the mental health impacts of marginalisation and aims to uplift intersectional communities wherever possible. So also Amberly wanted to mention that she's the founder of a project called Translate. It's an arts project that aims to uplift the voices and lived experience of queer, disabled Australian artists and advocates. So thank you so much, Amberly, and everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm going to take over there if that's okay. And before we begin, I'm just going to quickly do an acknowledgement of country. So I wanted to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I live on, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I also wanted to pay my respects to traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and the Torres Strait Islands. We acknowledge their continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders who came before, those that lead now and those who will lead in the future. And I might also get everyone else to share where you're from in the chat as well, what country you're on. And I wanted to also note that today we're going to be exploring some difficult issues like suicide, discrimination and abuse. And if these discussions cause any distress, I wanted you all to know that this is a safe space. So you can also reach out to QLife, which is our national queer support service. And yeah, that's the address there. These are also some of the talking points for today. So one of them is, what is LGBTIQ plus disability advocacy and why is it important? What are some of the barriers this advocacy tries to overcome? How does LGBTQ plus disability advocacy relate to the mental health system and suicide prevention? How are queer disability advocates creating change in mental health systems and suicide prevention? Can connecting with our community help us break down the barriers we face? And we've also got quite a few questions that you've all submitted, as well as a Q&A. I wanted to also start by just defining, based on my own definition and lived experience, what queer disability advocacy is. And LGBTIQA SB plus disability advocacy can be defined as advocacy that promotes, affirms, protects and supports the human rights of the queer disability community. This is a really amazing poster by Rainbow Inclusion, which is a queer organisation for people with intellectual disability. And I think it's really relevant to what we're discussing. So in this poster, you can see be safe, be respected, be equal, be in a relationship, be heard, and be yourself. And in the background, there are different areas of everyday experience as well where those rights should be enacted. So at home, going places, at work, at hospital, at places of worship, and basically everywhere. I also wanted to mention that attempts to violate these rights create the barriers that queer disability advocacy strives to overcome. And I thought it would be interesting to draw on a recently released report which actually looked into the lived experience of queer people with disability. And this is one of the slides that Rainbow Inclusion created to accompany that report. It was part of the Disability Commission into the exploitation and discrimination of the disability community. The report draws on data from individuals who participated in Private Lives 3 or Writing Themselves in 4, which was the largest ever survey of LGBTIQA+ adults and young people in Australia. This is a really heavy quote that's actually been taken from that report, so I just wanted to spend some time on this quickly. The quote says, LGBTIQA+ people with disability reported substantially greater challenges and poorer outcomes than LGBTIQA+ people without disability, including experiences of violence, abuse, and neglect. The impact of this in the lives of LGBTIQA+ people with disability is significant and may be reflected in the high numbers reporting suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, higher than those without disability.
Amberly, sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
A couple of people have flagged that the interpreter can't be seen, so I'm just going to unpin and repin them and see.
All I can see is my slides, by the way. So.
Yeah, I'll try and see if we can put you both pinned together. See if that's working for everyone. Is that working? Can someone check in the chat? Maybe if Amberly talk and
if you let me know.
Yes, a couple of yeses and a no. A couple of no, a yes, a no, a no.
Maybe should I keep speaking?
Two, I think probably keep going. They're both pinned, so yeah.
To see if unpinning Amberly would solve the problem and see if people can see.
Right.
Yeah, you can't see two things at the same time. Can people see now?
We'll try that. How's that? Okay, we'll go with that.
Yeah, that solved it from the looks of it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Apologies, Amberly.
That's okay. I might actually ask people in the audience what your thoughts are about this quote and what it means in terms of the mental health of queer people with disability. If it resonates with you and your lived experience or your work as a practitioner, I think it would be a really interesting talking point. This is another slide from Rainbow Health Australia, which says the report findings show that people with disability are more likely than most in the queer community to feel excluded, more likely to be subjected to harassment or abuse, and more likely to experience poor mental health. And I wanted to highlight a quote from a member of the community. Her name's Ivy, pronouns she, her. She's queer, trans, with a progressive neurological, cognitive, physical, and psychosocial disability. And she says, as a young trans person with a complex disability, I will assume your services are not safe for people like me and for people like my partner and my chosen family. And I wanted to actually highlight the fact that a lack of access to inclusive mental health and suicide prevention services is one of the key areas that queer disability advocacy seeks to address. This is just another slide from Rainbow Health Australia, which says that there is so much strength and expertise amongst the queer disability sectors, with meaningful involvement of LGBTIQA+ people with disability at every level, we can work together to reform systems and services to be genuinely inclusive, safe, and welcoming for LGBTQIA+ people with disability in Australia. And this is my final slide for my intro, which basically is just a comment that I made, which says, in telling our stories of neglect, abuse, violence, and discrimination, queer disability advocates fight against deficits in the mental health system and show pride in our unique experiences and identities despite the barriers we face. These slides will actually be available to anyone who wants them as well, and I've included some resources at the end. So feel free to reach out to Liz and she can share them with you. So I'm going to stop sharing this now. Liz, is that okay?
Yeah, certainly. And I'll send these out with the post webinar info.
Perfect. I was feeling very disconnected. I couldn't see anybody. So that's brought us to our panel discussion, and one of the first themes of the panel discussion is the barriers in mental health and suicide prevention context. So I wanted to actually ask Amy to step in now, if that's okay. And the question here would be, how can we better support the community to understand the impacts of marginalisation associated with this intersectionality?
Thanks so much, Amberly. And hello, everyone. My name is Amy. My pronouns are she, they. And I think it's a really interesting question to think about. So how can we support the community to understand those impacts intersectionally and more broadly as well, and supporting them to see what is happening for us in the queer and disabled community? And I think one of the first things we can do is what we're doing today, having that conversation and sharing our lived experience. I think that's such a rich way of people to such a rich way for people to know what someone's experience can be like, is to learn from other people's real experiences, and not just the experience, I think, but the richness of what that actually meant. So having a detailed understanding of what was it like when they couldn't find a service that was safe, or what is it like for Ivy when she feels that services aren't going to be safe for her from that beginning. And so giving that context too, it's more than just one thing. It has a really big impact on someone, particularly when we're talking about mental health and suicide as well within the community. So I think breaking it down into what the impact is and how the different levels of identity and marginalisation work together as well to increase, I suppose, the risk that someone does experience marginalisation. For someone that may not be part of any of these communities, understanding just one aspect of the discrimination, the challenges, might be really hard for them. And so being able to bring in these individually at a moment like this is what it's like to access services as a queer person, put on top of that accessing a service with my disability, how do we mesh these things together? And that creates additional demand for us as service users. And so showing that, I think, in the individual ways, bringing that together so they can see the whole process. Okay, if people are experiencing these things coming to us as services, what is the impact of if you put that on top and on top? So you start to do that layering. I also think it's really important that we can promote sort of meaningful engagement when we are thinking about sharing experiences. So making sure we want to hear people's real experiences of marginalisation. And part of that, I think, is having people on the receiving end, so the community in general that are trying to understand these impacts of marginalisation associated with the intersectionality, for them to feel safe enough to reflect on their own experiences, their bias, and what they are bringing into this as well. So creating an environment where they feel safe enough to sort of peel away at what their experience has been so they can create new experiences, and that can take some compassion and safety for them to be like, oh, I didn't realize it was like that. How can I change and do better?
Yeah, it's funny, Amy, like you just touched on something I was thinking about as well. Like it requires a level of vulnerability on both sides. So it requires the person with an intersectional identity to become vulnerable, but it also requires the practitioner or service to admit we may not know enough we need to learn, and that's a vulnerability as well. So it's about those two vulnerabilities coming together, and that does require safety. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. Thank you. The next question is for Will, and it's been asked by community as well. And what are some of the barriers our advocacy tries to overcome?
Thank you, Amberly. Hi, everyone. My name's William. My pronouns are he, him, and my physical description is burgundy, very curly hair that's got a bit of frizz with a red shawl on. Very happy to see people so interested in today's panel discussion. I think Amy's said so much of what's needed to be said in such a great way, and Amberly, you as well. I think one of the most important factors of advocacy is, I guess, the systems to understand what recipients and participants go through. So I'll speak from myself, who identifies as an autistic person with intellectual disability on top of my other intersections. Sometimes the service systems that we tend to use to gain support can be a lot of a barrier. And I think there's not a great understanding from an upper level because of the underrepresentation of people with disability in those higher areas, especially with systems that we use. And I think another giant barrier is the common, I think the mixture of the term inclusion and tokenism are so mixed up a lot of the time within multiple marginalizations, especially within LGBTIQ. I think there's a lot of people saying, we want these things, and then you see in actual outcomes that there's an underfunding in, you know, queer represented organizations, for example, in the disability sector. I've seen places where, you know, queer organizations are commonly underrepresented. So I think there's like the service system understanding, I think it's the underrepresentation of these important organizations in those higher places. But I also think with the common just intersectional interaction between people who aren't on the recipient side of the fence, there is so much internalized ableism and homophobia, transphobia, and a lot of other examples. I'll just use one that's been used recently. So I think the discrimination of intersex in the census recently, which I believe is in the midst of being mended, I think that shouldn't have been a mistake to begin with. It's a whole community that felt discriminated in a community-led, like, I guess interface is, it's not an easy thing to break down, but I think there's so much to break down in terms of barriers because there are so many things, but I think those are my 3 things I would highlight. Thank you.
Yep, thanks for sharing that, Will. The next section explores advocacy as a solution in the mental health and suicide prevention space. So Amy, this actually I might get you both to answer this question if that's okay. Starting with Amy, how are queer disability advocates creating change in mental health systems and suicide prevention?
Thank you. I think a big part of it is what William was just talking about, and that's the representation that people with that lived experience of multiple intersectionalities brings, and having that being really genuine. I loved that description between like not having that being tokenistic. And to me, that change is being driven every time someone with these experiences is doing work at the different levels. So for me, it's not just about seeing people that are, you know, doing that front-facing work out on the ground, but it's making sure that you've got someone that is queer and disabled and experiencing these marginalizations, writing policy and doing the research and doing the work that happens behind the scenes, writing the grants before these projects are getting up and before the services are getting up, so that it begins already to be from that lens. So that we're bringing that lens of what does it look like to experience mental health, and also noticing that that is separate from suicide prevention for a lot of people too, that suicide prevention doesn't have to necessarily equate to that experience of having a mental health challenge too. So I think having that visibility is a really key part, because that also brings then, I think, an accountability to the people and the teams that are working on these things. And I had thought about it earlier, Amberly, it's really nice you pick up on that vulnerability, because it is accountability through vulnerability. The people have to be able to be vulnerable to say, I don't understand what that is, or actually this is something that you might like to do different. And people have to be vulnerable to be able to do that, and accountable to the decisions that they're making as well to those communities.
Yep, well said. And I think I've just realised also that part of that vulnerability is acknowledging, like with the census, well, we've made a mistake, we're sorry, and then move forward with a solution that acknowledges what's happened. Yeah, well, I'll just repeat the question as well. How are queer disability advocates creating change in mental health systems and suicide prevention?
Thank you. I think there's a lot to unpack with that question. I think one of the things I think there is like acknowledgement needed is people talking about the topic of suicide prevention to, I guess, the change makers and also like policy, you know, decision makers in government. I think that topic needs to be opened up, and I think there's kind of a closed-mindedness when it comes to I guess receiving that kind of information, because there are a lot of closed-minded individuals or people who have, I guess, a stigma around the topic of suicide, but if we don't talk about it, we don't make change. It's that simple. And I think there's a lot of incredible advocates with like a big load of service system changes. Within the mental health system, I know there are people actively trying to make, you know, crisis support more accessible and less confronting, because people on the ground level who receive those supports have said in the past that they are not effective. Some people don't take the time to understand and be patient with you. But I think there's also the other side of that, where crisis support on helplines, there are some of the good bunch, but there's also a lot of crisis supports that will like say, it's all right, walk it off, you'll be fine. I think there's a lot of value in listening to people who use those systems, just because I think people providing said supports don't have a general understanding of what that's like. And unless you listen to those people, you're not going to get a clear picture. I remember another friend of mine, I won't say their name just because I want to keep it confidential, but I remember there was an instance where they weren't doing well, and they said to the crisis support person on the helpline, like, I'm not doing well. And they were taking testosterone, and they were like, oh, well, it's probably the medication you're taking. So why are you talking to me then? So it's like something like that is not okay. It's just like you need to do your reading. You need to understand what people go through on the daily, and you need to not make those assumptions before opening your mouth, because people can significantly get hurt from trauma that they've experienced by bad service like that they've received. So provide that comforting space and give people that time.
Exactly. And you make a really good point, because often when members of the community are experiencing suicidal ideation or they've had an attempt, again, they're really vulnerable. And being mistreated in that moment can actually be an additional trauma and cause more damage. But you're right, that is unfortunately what's currently happening because of the way the system's working. I can share a story of a friend who was in a psych ward and she was being repeatedly misgendered. You know, you'll know who she is, but I won't say her name. Repeatedly misgendered by staff, which just made her feel really unsafe. So these things continue to happen and they are barriers. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Will. The next question is actually for me, and the question is, how can and when should I make contact with an advocate? I think there's two potential options for this question. The first would be if you're struggling to navigate a system. So an example would be the NDIS, or maybe it would be Centrelink or the legal system or the medical system. If you feel you don't have support in that, then I would say that would be a good point in time to reach out to an advocate. The second option would be if your human rights have been violated, and that does happen. And I think that at that point, you should also consider reaching out to an advocate. And we haven't really talked much about the different types of advocacy, but your specific situation would actually require a specific type of advocacy as well, whether it's you advocating for yourself or seeking out legal advocacy or seeking out another type of advocacy, like representation. I think, yeah, it's a complicated question in a lot of ways, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's really simple. Maybe we inherently know when things are bad or we need more support. And at that point in time where you've got that feeling, that's when you should be seeking out some advocacy for yourself. I hope that answered the question. So, William, this question is for you. And the question is, I would love to learn more about how to accelerate my career in the queer mental health and suicide prevention sector.
I think I'm still learning about this myself, to be honest, but I think the best thing you can do is, I guess, work alongside your peers and really be connected with your community. It's not easy for a lot of people, especially those who are coming out into themselves with their identities, you know, their gender affirmations, and you know, I think there's a lot of contributing factors to why people wouldn't see the benefit, because they don't see the benefit if they've got this internalized fear of people's reactions. So my experience has been like incredible, connecting with other queer folk and getting really like good advice from my peers and people I work with. And like I haven't even been to a Pride march yet. So, you know, it's something I'm still learning and something I'm still healing with because of the years of internalized homophobia for me personally. And I've finally got a circle of friends that have been like, you know, come into our basket. It's been such a lovely experience, but I also think within the working space, I think there's a lot of common themes of funding. You're going to get sick of me saying funding by the end of this panel discussion, because it's one of the main barriers that LGBTI-led organizations face unless they're mainstream like directed. So my advice is get your foot in the door with someone you know that is connected to an LGBTIQ organization. I would also say be patient with the process, because it's not always going to be quick, especially in uncertain times as like the amount of reform we're going through currently. I wouldn't expect an instant yes, unfortunately. And I wouldn't go further to say there's work available everywhere, because it's really difficult to say when things are going to be a bit more solid. I don't know, but yeah, I think, yeah, stay connected with your community. I think work together with others, and I think just stay as aware with, you know, positions coming out, working with peer groups. Volunteering at places has been helpful for friends of mine and myself. And I guess just getting to know folk in support areas of LGBTIQ, because you know, I learned from Amberly, you know, before I came into my own with LGBTI disability advocacy. Amberly was actually one of the people I learned from. So, you know, it's like, I think just learn from your peers is the most helpful thing I can put forward.
Yeah. I also wanted to acknowledge a comment in the chat from T Caputo. They say, we also need more genuine compensation for those within the community with lived experience who are sharing that and undertaking the mental, emotional, physical load that comes with doing so, as well as peer support workers, etc. There's still a tokenistic theme surrounding asking people to disclose their lived experience in order to educate and inform people, but they deserve to be adequately compensated beyond kudos for that. Yes,
Absolutely.
arguably the most impactful organisations are grassroots, community managed, and completely, completely underfunded. It's so frustrating. T, I think you're so right. And I think part of that reason for the grassroots organisations being the most impactful is there's like a horizontal power structure. So there's no hierarchy. So because it's a horizontal power structure, there's more impact. Because yeah, that's what I think anyway.
Sorry, Amberly, can I quickly add one more thing? Just to add to that, I think also with that tokenism and inclusion aspect, it's really important to enforce the, I think organizations will offer opportunities for like free of charge, but I think we're moving into a space where like people being paid for their time, because they're opening up their interactions with systems. They're talking about direct trauma that's like been really impactful to their lives, and people are doing research, and these university researchers. I think there's good aspects to like opening up the door with these research projects, but you also got to balance at the same time that these are people with living experience, active, saying living because they're still going. And I think if you want people to partake in these like really impactful research pieces or projects, you've got to compensate. I think that's, in my opinion, non-negotiable.
I agree. You've got to actually give people a seat at the table and demonstrate that you value their contribution. Yeah. Amy, I wanted to come back to you and ask you, this question is a little bit similar to an earlier question, but not quite. It's about barriers to advocacy. And this question asks, what are some of the barriers that you face as a queer disability advocate, and how do you overcome these?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that living experience, that we are advocating living and functioning in the system still. You know, we're advocating against the system that is still very much oppressing, discriminating, and we're marginalized in that. And so that has many different tolls. There is the fatigue that comes from the advocacy fatigue in terms of going up against those systems. But then also we're still navigating what's happening for us. And I know for me, my health can really fluctuate, and that can at times make doing the work and advocacy really challenging as well. So being able to find places where you can be supported to take the time that you need to get look after yourself and be the best version of you, not for anyone else, just for your own general well-being, I have found really important to be able to be transparent as well. for me, the biggest barrier to that is, am I going to be accepted? So are they going to understand what my needs are? Are they going to help me support that? And that feeling of having to sometimes prove your worth is really exhausting. So you want to know that when you are sharing your identities and what you need and doing the advocacy, that it will be received appropriately. And I think part of that is some of the stuff that we've touched on here today, that compensation, that recognizing of your ability as well. But I think that, yeah, there is a hypervigilance that I certainly experience when I'm doing this work about how am I being perceived and what is happening, and needing to be reassured by the people around, which is why I really appreciate what you were talking about, William, with that strength of community. For me, we might touch on community later, everyone, but for me, I think the community is a really huge part of helping me to overcome that barrier, knowing that I'm not alone in this, and having other people reflect the voices back to me that helps me to understand how I feel as well, and then also grow and learn from myself. A big part of what I've learned is not from books and things, it's actually from folks like yourself on LinkedIn, like communities that I've become part of and been fortunate enough to connect with. So that will always be the most meaningful and impactful way to help overcome some of that fear, fatigue, and challenge when you're advocating in a system that you're also just trying to survive in.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've been asked to answer this question as well. I think, to be very honest and to draw on my lived experience, one of the barriers I face is discrimination and marginalisation as a gender diverse person who's autistic. So when I attempt to self-advocate or advocate for other people, I'm often not treated seriously, or I'm treated as though I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm not educated, or do you know what I mean? Like, it's definitely like a power imbalance where I'm not given a seat at the table, basically. And I think that that's a real barrier, because when you're trying to create change, sometimes you're not given a seat at the table to create that change. And a second barrier would be dealing with disability, like dealing with your own disability. You know what I mean? Like, for me, like, I have a psychosocial disability and I'm autistic. And when you're in a position where you need to self-advocate, you're often triggered and you're often not cognitively capable in that moment to actually do what needs to be done. And I think that disability can be a barrier, and that's why sometimes we need other people, we need community, we need other advocates to support us and to guide us through.
Absolutely. Can I just say one more thing quickly?
Yeah, please do.
Sorry, Liz, as well. It just makes me think about the strength of advocacy, because when we're showing up in perhaps distress or experiencing the impacts of our disability, maybe we've got pain and it's challenging to focus, having to then go to a service and ask for suicide prevention while also explaining my gender identity and my sexuality, and don't ask if I've got a husband at my house, it's all of those things. Like, I shouldn't have to cover those while also trying to get life-saving, life-affirming treatment. And so I think for me, just really reinforcing that the load we can reduce that for people by having services that are safe and inclusive as well.
Yeah, by literally embedding the inclusivity, so it's already a given that we don't have to expose ourselves. Yeah, I agree.
I had a question I was going to chuck in here. It just fit better here than at the end of the session, and it's come in the Q&A, and I'll put it into the chat now. How can white European LGBTIQA+ disability advocates acknowledge and disrupt the Eurocentric underpinnings in our work and the suicide prevention space, and challenge white supremacy and colonialism? So any of you that want to jump in on that one, I'll disappear again.
Amy, do you have any thoughts?
I love the idea of disrupting that. And I think for me, that is, again, about the voices that we centre and acknowledging that as well. So where we can, having that diversity of voice, so that people that are bringing that white Eurocentric viewpoint can learn from that I know it's an area that I'm very much developing in, and I really enjoy the chance to do that. And it is an area that I'm still working in very much myself. So being able to have people, resources, diversity of voice and opinion, and time to learn from that. So, and again, that's about showing respect to the people who are sharing with us. There's a real graciousness of someone to take time to support me in my practice, and yeah, showing some real respect towards that.
Will, your hand's up.
I also wanted to jump in and say a few things if possible. I'll try and not take too long because I'm aware that there's more questions. But I think don't reinvent the wheel. I also think you should look at other like countries and take examples of like movements, take examples of policy changes, or I guess like LGBTI focus organizations. There have been a lot of them in Australia who have been historically involved in pushing against the grain in that regard. So I definitely recommend I guess learning from peers across the world is like a witness to that after my visit to the United Nations this year. I think that I've learned a really valuable lesson is that different places have different lessons into current day policy. And I think instead of like looking at the big issue and being like, whoa, this is terrifying, you can look at your peers who are in your corner across the ocean and be like, oh, they're already starting to work. Let's use that as a starting point. So I think that's all I'd say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And as you're both speaking, I actually also realised the marginalisation that we experience, so transphobia, homophobia, they are also steeped in white, settler, colonial perspectives. So anything outside the boundary or the binary that's challenged and discriminated against, that comes from colonial white settler behaviour, if that makes any sense. So I think we can actually acknowledge that and say that what we're dealing with is also coming from, it's the same discrimination and marginalisation coming from white, patriarchal, often misogynist power structures. So there is, the space there is related, if that makes any sense. That's how I come to it. But I also am conscious of having white privilege myself, so it's even more complicated. But I acknowledge that, and yeah, it's an honour to actually hold space with people from diverse cultures. I think that's my thought process. That brings us to our final question. I think that's a really good segue. The final question is about community connection, plus some other questions that people have been asking. So, Amy, I might get you to kick us off. The question is, can connecting with our community help us break down the barriers that we face?
Yes, I'm just really passionate about this. I think connecting with our community can help us to tap into the strengths of ourselves, our community, our viewpoints. That can, I think, really bolster our strength and our energy when we're coming up against that fatigue and not worrying if there'll be safe spaces. Having our own safe community is a really important part of that to give us strength and back us on that journey. And there is so much pride in all of our communities and all of our identities. And so we know that we're disproportionately impacted by things like discrimination, suicidality. We're also really disproportionately impacted by sheer fabulousness and creativity and awesomeness and strength in adversity. And I think recognizing that within ourselves is, and I know this might just sound like faffy words, but actually I think we're just, I have so much love for this community, you know. So yeah, that helps me when things are feeling hard, is to know I'm not alone.
I agree. It's that shared experience, knowing that we are connected through the fight for something better. I agree. Will, what do you think?
I think it's a definite obvious answer. Yes, absolutely. I think there's so much you can gain from gathering together in community and talking about barriers. I think there's also a shared um I think there's the best way to put it is there's a shared pain in community when you do certain advocacy where you don't feel necessarily isolated. Advocacy feels cooperative and community connected in my experience in the space. I have such a love for it because the reason why I came to love my identities is because of coming into the space. Before the working in the disability sector and other marginalizations as well, I was I was internally ableist, I was internally homophobic, I was scared to embrace my identities. I had a very supportive, immediate family, but the community service systems that I was raised around didn't necessarily feel supportive. So I kind of created that fear in myself as well. But I also wanted to mention, sometimes when there's a lot of reform happening at the same time, advocacy fatigue is such like advocacy fatigue is such a big thing, especially in all corners of advocacy in our space in queer, it's within the mental health sector, it's within the disability sector, it's absolutely everywhere. And all I can say is self-care is so important. And I scream this to all of the incredible advocates watching this today, because I see a lot of your work on LinkedIn and otherwise in my space. And I I know you're watching and listening to this, and some of my friends are probably going, oh, here's William going off again. But, self-care is such an important thing. I'm actively trying to do that. And I don't know what the definition of self-care in advocacy fatigue looks like, but everybody's is different. So just be sure to, I guess, take care of yourself and people you care about in the midst of these incredible, horrid, really messy fights we're facing, is the last thing I'd say.
Yeah, I totally agree. Self-care is really important. And as you were mentioning self-care, Will, I also kind of was thinking about the concept of community care as well as self-care. So community care being that thing where we're literally all taking care of others with an acknowledgement of the shared experience. And I think that's really important, to actually be able to move beyond our own direct needs and start taking care of other people. It's not always an easy thing either. If we're really struggling and we're surviving, to be able to move beyond ourselves and our own needs and help other people. But I think that it's really important. And yeah, that's probably my answer as well. There's an additional question I also wanted to, before we wind up, talk about. And the question was, we've recognised the need for community-led and controlled organisations championing change for queer people with disability, but many mainstream queer service providers are increasingly taking on an increasingly advocacy role, I guess what they say. But what should we do about this if we want more community control? So I guess what they're saying is, how do we navigate mainstream queer organisations taking on a role rather than disability organisations, I think?
I'll jump in. I think the answer to that is, I think people are still figuring that out. I think there's a lot of organizations who are trying their best to cooperate with mainstream, because I think the disability space is such a confined thing to public media, but there's also this wider, bigger beast, I'll call it, where mainstream is a scary place sometimes. And I think there's people actively trying to take on these mainstream service providers and community-facing services. But I think there's also like an aspect of there's interpretation of what disability advocacy and disability affirming is, and that's to do with like queer disabled folk as well. I think is like a lot of people love to go for the quota and meet their KPI so that they're meeting inclusive criteria, and it's the full tokenistic like charity aspect of things. So I think the thing is they're like 10 years behind the social model. So it's not necessarily effective to have that mentality, but also if I guess like, and like I'm completely saying this from an individual basis from none of my organizational hats. This is completely me as a person with disability who has received service systems. Government need to do better in mainstream. Like it's just as simple as that. It's not, it doesn't mean having people front of staff in hospitality. It doesn't mean having people stacking shelves in a Kmart. It means having them in staff meetings, value their qualities and skills, actually value them as a human being. Get into the social model, people. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with what you're saying. Thanks for sharing that. I think as you were speaking, Will, I also was drawn back to something Amy said earlier, and also one of the slides from my quick intro, which is that we need queer disabled people embedded in every single level of the power structure. And that includes within mainstream queer organisations. So we need representation at every level. I think that that's the thing, and that's what we're lacking at the moment. We're lacking genuine representation. And I'm talking about like diversity within disability representation as well, because at the moment there are a lot of echo chambers, I think, to be honest, and I feel like we need more racial, cultural, sexual, gender diversity within the disability space at every level. There was another question as well, which was listed in the chat, which I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, and that was, do we need a repository where people can report experiences of queerphobia when using services that have traumatized them, so we as a community can have it recorded? Otherwise, people's experiences of trauma get lost in the system. Amy.
I think it's a really nice thought to have a way for those experiences to not get lost in the system, and for them to help to generate change and doing better as well, and generate discussion around people's experience. So I think that would be an amazing thing to have if you knew you could go somewhere to share that experience after you've been through it, to be seen, to be validated, and then also to help support other people and help support that organisation or that person to do a bit better.
Yeah. What about you, Will? What do you think?
I think I'm going to try and come to the quickest answer possible because I'm aware we're getting close to time and I'll ramble on for the rest of the day if I don't stop myself. I think there needs data and like collecting analytics of people's discrimination is one step of 10. Like there's like so much that needs to be done in terms of like what does actual response systems look like when abuse or suicide prevention is reported? Like what's the active step happening when that data is collected? Because my fear in multiple marginalizations is when people go through really difficult things and become a statistic, like then the dehumanizing happens, which is not what anybody needs in any intersectionality. That includes First Nation folk and Indigenous, that includes queer and disabled folk, like that includes the neurodiverse space, you know, like I think there needs to be, like, I'm all for consultation, co-design, and collecting data so that government can look at it, but I think there needs to be more active work done to the responses, and there needs to be more like active things done, because I hope to see a decrease in those statistics. Like, I don't want the next Royal Commission to say, this is how many more statistics have died. Like, I want to see more proactive measures taken.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for sharing that, Will. I just wanted to quickly share Elizabeth's comment. Elizabeth says, self-care is not about not caring about others. It's not a zero-sum game. It's about taking care of ourselves and giving ourselves the care we need for our individual situations. Lining with others is actually part of self-care. Yeah. I think that's a really good point to wind up for today. So I just want to thank Amy and William for sharing your amazing lived experiences. And I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for your amazing participation. And I also wanted to thank Liz and everyone from LGBTI Health Australia for this opportunity. I think it's really important for us to get our lived experiences out there and to come into a space like this. So I just wanted to thank everybody.
Thank you so much, Amberly and Amy and Will and our interpreters. I think Amberly said really what needs to be said, but many thanks, much in awe of all of you and what you've shared today. And yeah, I'm going to chuck the survey link just to give feedback for today into the chat. Answering those does really help us support these kind of activities going forward, so we can do more of these. And yeah, don't forget that if this has raised anything for you today, that there's support available, which you can find via QLife, and there's qlife.org.au is their website. Thanks again, everybody, and we wish you all a great rest of the week.